She was abandoned in Scorpion Gulch by her mother for being barren, left to die under the merciless Texas sun with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart shattered by betrayal. Until 4 Comanche children found her half dead among the rocks and changed both their worlds forever. The morning sun blazed like a furnace over the Winchester Ranch, casting long shadows across the dusty courtyard where chickens pecked at scattered corn and a lone windmill creaked in the desert. Breeze. Martha Jane Winchester stood motionless beside the wooden fence, her calloused hands gripping the rough-hewn rails as she watched her younger sister, Emma's children, chase each other around the barn. Their laughter rang out across the homestead, like church bells on Sunday morning, pure and joyful and utterly foreign to Martha's ears. At 28, Martha had the weathered look of a woman who'd spent her life fighting the harsh realities of frontier existence. Her auburn hair, once vibrant as autumn leaves, had been dulled by years of alkali dust and relentless sun. Her green eyes, which had once sparkled with dreams of her own family, now held the resigned emptiness of hopes repeatedly crushed. She wore a simple brown dress, patched and repatched, that hung loose on her thin frame. A body that had failed her in the most fundamental way a woman's body could fail. Martha Jane. The voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Prudence Winchester emerged from the ranch house, her black dress severe as a funeral shroud, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the weathered skin of her face. At 55, Prudence ruled the Winchester homestead with an iron will forged by decades of surviving in a land that killed the weak and devoured the unprepared. She had buried 2 husbands, raised 5 children to adulthood, and built one of the most prosperous cattle operations in West Texas through sheer determination and ruthless pragmatism. Martha turned slowly, already knowing from her mother's tone that whatever was coming would not be pleasant. Prudence's steel-gray eyes held no warmth, no maternal affection, only the cold calculation of a woman making a business decision. "Pack your things," Prudence said without preamble. "Samuel Garrett's wagon leaves for El Paso at dawn. You'll be on it." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. Samuel Garrett was a grizzled buffalo hunter who made occasional supply runs between the scattered settlements of West Texas, his wagon train notorious for taking on cargo and passengers that other, more respectable outfits wouldn't touch. Criminals, fleeing justice, fallen women seeking new lives, and desperate souls with nowhere else to turn. "Mother, I don't understand, don't you?" Prudence's voice was sharp as broken glass. 5 years married to poor Jacob before the consumption took him, and not so much as a miscarriage to show for it. 3 years since, and every eligible man in the territory knows about your barren womb. You're 28 years old, Martha Jane, and you're never going to give this family the grandchildren it needs to survive. Martha felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The ranch that had been her entire life, the only home she'd ever known, suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Emma's children's laughter seemed to mock her from across the yard, a constant reminder of everything she could never provide. "This is my home," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Papa built this place. Jacob and I were going to raise our children here." "Your papa's dead," Prudence replied with brutal efficiency. "Jacob's dead. And the children you were supposed to raise never existed and never will. This ranch needs strong backs and fertile wombs to keep it running. Emma's got 4 little ones already and another on the way. Her husband Tom can work cattle and fix machinery. What can you do besides remind everyone of failure?" The cruelty of the words was breathtaking in its casual delivery. Martha had known her mother was disappointed in her inability to conceive, but she had never imagined Prudence would cast her out like a broken tool, no longer useful for its intended purpose. "I work as hard as anyone," Martha said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I can ride and rope and brand cattle. I can cook and clean and tend the sick. I helped deliver Emma's babies. I nursed Papa through his final illness. And what good is any of that if you can't pass the Winchester name to the next generation? Prudence turned her back, already walking toward the house as if the conversation were over. A barren woman is a burden, not a blessing. Samuel's wagon train will take you to El Paso, where you can find work in one of the hotels or maybe catch a stage further west. California is full of desperate men who might not care about children. You can't just throw me away like a broken horseshoe, Martha called after her, desperation creeping into her voice. I'm your daughter. Prudence stopped at the porch. Steps but didn't turn around. You stopped being my daughter the day Dr. Morrison confirmed what we all already knew. A woman who can't bear children isn't a woman at all. She's just taking up space that could be better used by someone who can contribute to the family's future. The kitchen door slammed shut with a finality that echoed across the ranch yard. Martha stood alone beside the fence, watching Emma's children continue their games, oblivious to the family drama unfolding around them. The youngest, a boy of perhaps 4, caught sight of her and waved cheerfully. She managed a weak smile and waved back, knowing it might be the last time she'd see any of them. That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and red, Martha packed her few belongings into a battered carpet bag. Her entire life reduced to 2 changes of clothes, her mother's old Bible, a tintype photograph of her late husband Jacob, and the small gold wedding ring she still wore despite 3 years of widowhood. Everything else, all the little treasures and mementos that made a house a home, would stay behind for Emma's growing family. Emma herself appeared in the doorway as Martha folded her last dress. At 25, Emma was everything Martha was not. Blonde where Martha was auburn, soft where Martha was weathered, visibly pregnant where Martha remained heartbreakingly empty. But her blue eyes held genuine distress as she watched her older sister prepare for exile. Martha, I'm so sorry, Emma whispered, glancing nervously toward the main house where their mother's silhouette could be seen moving past the windows. I tried to talk to her, but you know how she gets when she's made up her mind. It's not your fault, Martha replied, though part of her wondered if Emma had fought very hard to keep her sister around. With Martha gone, Emma would be the undisputed mistress of the Winchester Ranch, her children the sole inheritors of everything their grandfather had built. Maybe it's for the best, Emma continued, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. Maybe you'll find happiness somewhere else. Maybe you'll find a man who doesn't care about children. Or maybe there's some treatment in the big cities. Martha almost laughed at the naive hope in her sister's voice. Emma had never faced real hardship, never been told she was fundamentally flawed as a woman. Her faith in happy endings was touching and infuriating in equal measure. Maybe, Martha agreed, though she felt no such optimism. At 28, with no money, no connections, and no prospects, she was being cast adrift in a world that had little patience for women who couldn't fulfill their biological destiny. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with a bitter wind that promised an early winter. Samuel Garrett's wagon train assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, a motley collection of freight wagons, supply carts, and human cargo seeking passage to wherever the trail might lead. Garrett himself was a mountain of a man, his beard gray as winter frost, his eyes the pale blue of ice on a frozen pond. He looked Martha up and down with the calculating gaze of someone assessing livestock. "Winchester woman," he said by way of greeting. "Your ma says you need passage to El Paso." "Yes, sir," Martha replied, clutching her carpetbag with white knuckles. "I can pay my way." Garrett spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Payment's already been arranged. Your ma's trading beef cattle for passage. Question is, what kind of passenger are you? Trouble or quiet?" "Quiet, sir." "Good. Climb in the back of the supply wagon. Keep your head down and your mouth shut. This ain't no pleasure excursion, and I ain't running a boarding house." Martha climbed into the designated wagon, finding herself surrounded by sacks of flour, barrels of salt pork, and crates of ammunition. The only other passenger was a Mexican woman of perhaps 40, her face carved with lines of hard experience. She nodded once at Martha but didn't speak. As the wagon train pulled away from the Winchester Ranch, Martha looked back one last time at the only home she'd ever known. Prudence stood on the front porch, her arms crossed, watching the departure with the same expression she might wear while observing cattle being driven to market. Emma was nowhere to be seen. The first day of travel passed in a haze of dust, heat, and jolting wagon wheels. The Texas landscape rolled past in endless waves of brown grass and scattered mesquite, broken occasionally by dry creek beds and distant mesas. Martha had traveled this country before, but always with the security of knowing she had a home to return to. Now each mile took her further from everything familiar and deeper into an uncertain future. On the second day, trouble began. The Mexican woman, whose name was Rosa, fell violently ill during the afternoon heat. She vomited repeatedly, her skin burning with fever, her breathing shallow and labored. Martha did what she could, using water from her own precious supply to cool Rosa's forehead and forcing small sips between the woman's cracked lips. Probably cholera, Garrett announced when Martha approached him during the evening stop. Best thing is to leave her behind before it spreads to the rest of us. You can't just abandon a sick woman, Martha protested. She needs medical attention. Garrett's laugh was harsh as a coyote's bark. Lady, we're 3 days from the nearest settlement and 2 weeks from El Paso. Ain't no doctors out here except the kind that dig graves. Rosa knew the risks when she paid for passage. That night, Rosa died quietly in Martha's arms, whispering what sounded like prayers in Spanish. Martha sat with the body until dawn, then helped Garrett and his men dig a shallow grave beside the trail. They marked it with a pile of stones and a crude wooden cross. One more forgotten soul lost to the unforgiving frontier. Happens more than you'd think, Garrett said as they resumed travel. Desert takes what it wants when it wants. On the fourth day, Martha began to understand why Rosa had been so fearful. The water barrels were running lower than expected, and Garrett's temper grew shorter with each mile. He began charging passengers extra for water rations, demanding payment in cash or personal belongings. When Martha protested that her mother had already paid for her passage, Garrett's response was a cold smile. Your ma paid for transport, not for luxury accommodations. Water costs extra, same as food and shelter. Martha handed over her wedding ring, the last tangible connection to her brief marriage and happier times. Garrett examined the gold band with professional interest before dropping it into his vest pocket. That'll buy you 3 days of water, he said. After that, we'll see what else you got to trade. By the 6th day, Martha had traded her spare dress for food and her mother's Bible for another day's water ration. She was down to the clothes on her back and the carpet bag that held only her photograph of Jacob and a few small personal items of no value to anyone else. The country grew more desolate with each passing mile. The grass disappeared entirely, replaced by rocks, sand, and the occasional barrel cactus. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, while nights brought a cold that seeped into bones and souls alike. Martha began to understand that her mother hadn't just banished her from the ranch. She had sentenced her to death as surely as if she'd put a noose around her neck. On the 7th day, Martha's water ran out entirely. Garrett refused to extend any more credit, his pale eyes holding no sympathy for her desperate pleas. She watched the other passengers carefully guard their own supplies, knowing that in this harsh land, charity was a luxury few could afford. There's a way you could earn more water, Garrett suggested that evening, his meaning clear from the way his gaze lingered on her body. Pretty woman like you, even a barren one, has something to offer a lonely man. Martha's response was to walk away from the campfire and spend the night shivering alone under the stars. Better to die with dignity than to survive through degradation. On the 8th day, disaster struck. A broken axle on one of the freight wagons forced the entire train to halt for repairs in the middle of a particularly desolate stretch of desert. The delay consumed their precious water reserves, and Garrett made the decision that would seal Martha's fate. "We're cutting dead weight," he announced as the sun reached its merciless zenith. "Anyone who can't pay for continued passage gets left behind." Martha knew she was the dead weight he meant. She had nothing left to trade, no value to offer except the degradation she had already refused. As the wagon train prepared to move on without her, she stood alone in a landscape that seemed designed by God to test human endurance to its breaking point. Scorpion Gulch stretched before her like a wound in the earth, a narrow canyon carved by flash floods and lined with rocks that radiated heat like oven stones. Garrett had chosen this place for her abandonment with deliberate cruelty. No shade, no water, no hope of rescue. Just miles of empty desert in every direction, and a sun that would cook her alive before nightfall. "Nothing personal," Garrett said as he climbed back onto his wagon. "But business is business, and charity ain't good business." Martha watched the wagon train disappear into the shimmering heat, taking with it her last connection to the world of the living. She was alone in Scorpion Gulch with no water, no food, no shelter, and no realistic hope of survival. Her mother had wanted her gone, and now she was as gone as a person could be while still breathing. The desert sun reached its murderous peak as Martha Jane Winchester collapsed against the red sandstone wall of Scorpion Gulch, her lips already cracked and bleeding from thirst. The rocks beneath her burned like coals from a blacksmith's forge, but she no longer had the strength to seek what little shade the narrow canyon offered. Above her, turkey vultures circled with patient hunger, their shadows crossing her face in rhythmic intervals like a countdown to death. Hours passed in a delirium of heat and despair. Martha drifted between consciousness and fevered dreams, where her late husband Jacob called to her from across fields of green grass that never existed in this barren land. She saw her sister Emma's children laughing and playing in cool creek water that transformed into mirages the moment she tried to reach for it. Most cruelly, she dreamed of babies that might have been phantom children with Jacob's gentle eyes and her own stubborn chin. All the sons and daughters her broken body had failed to create. The hallucinations grew more vivid as dehydration tightened its grip on her fevered mind. She imagined her mother standing at the rim of the canyon, not with the cold dismissal she had shown at the ranch, but with tears streaming down her weathered face. In this fever dream, Prudence Winchester begged forgiveness for her cruelty, reached down with loving arms to pull her daughter from the burning stones. But each time Martha tried to grasp those phantom hands, they dissolved into wisps of superheated air. The sun had moved perhaps 2 handspans across the merciless blue sky when the first shadow fell across her fevered face. Martha tried to focus her burning eyes, expecting to see another vulture preparing to claim its prize. Instead, she found herself looking up at a small figure silhouetted against the blazing sky. A child, impossibly, standing at the rim of the gulch 30 feet above her. The figure disappeared so quickly that Martha wondered if heat madness had finally claimed her sanity. But moments later, she heard the soft whisper of moccasined feet on stone, and 4 children materialized in the canyon below as if conjured from the desert air itself. They moved with the fluid grace of shadows, their dark eyes studying her with a mixture of curiosity and caution that spoke of survival instincts honed by generations of frontier warfare. The eldest was a girl of perhaps 12 summers, her black hair braided with beads and feathers that caught the harsh sunlight like captured rainbows. Her buckskin dress was decorated with intricate quillwork that spoke of skilled hands and patient artistry, each geometric pattern telling stories of her people's connection to the natural world. She carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility, her intelligent eyes missing nothing as she assessed Martha's desperate condition. This was Kashina, though Martha would not learn her name for hours yet to come. Behind her came a boy of 10 or 11, his face painted with thin lines of red and yellow ochre in patterns that seemed to capture the very essence of the desert. Wind. The designs were not mere decoration, but spiritual armor, symbols of protection and power passed down through countless generations of warriors. He carried a small bow crafted from seasoned oak and a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers, and his posture suggested he was ready to use them if this strange white woman proved dangerous. His name was Hanavi, and he had already seen more of life's harsh realities than most children twice his age. The third child was another girl, perhaps 8 years old, whose gentle demeanor contrasted sharply with the wariness of her companions. She carried a water gourd decorated with painted symbols of healing and growth, and a small pouch of what appeared to be medicinal herbs gathered from secret places known only to her grandmother. Her eyes held the kind of instinctive compassion that could not be taught, only nurtured by elders who understood that healing was as much about spirit as it was about medicine. She would be called Ayana by her people, meaning eternal flower, a name that captured her nurturing spirit perfectly. The youngest was a boy of 6 or 7, his round face still soft with childhood, despite the harsh environment that was already shaping him into the warrior he would become. He hung back behind the others, one thumb tucked into his mouth in a gesture that reminded Martha painfully of Emma's youngest son. His large dark eyes took in every detail of this unprecedented encounter with the white world, cataloging information with the intensity of someone who had been taught that observation could mean the difference between life and death. His name was Chaitan, meaning falcon, given to him because even as a baby he had shown an uncanny ability to spot things others missed. These 4 children belonged to a small band of Comanche who had been ranging through this territory for generations, following ancient patterns of migration that honored both the seasons and the sacred places of their ancestors. Their people were part of the great Nurmurnu, the true human beings, who had dominated the southern plains for 2 centuries before the coming of the white settlers. They were not supposed to be here alone, but the adults were 3 days ahead, tracking a herd of buffalo that might provide meat for the coming winter. The children had been left behind with the elderly and infirm at a traditional camping spot near a hidden spring. But youthful curiosity and the warrior training that began almost from birth had led them to explore the forbidden reaches of Scorpion Gulch. The canyon itself held special significance for their band. Legend spoke of spirits that dwelt among the red rocks, ancient powers that could either bless or curse those who entered without proper preparation. The children knew they were violating tribal law by being here, but something had drawn them to this place with a compulsion they could not resist. Now, finding this dying white woman seemed to confirm that supernatural forces were at work. Kashina spoke first, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her native tongue as she addressed her companions. The Comanche language was rich with nuances that had no equivalent in English, capable of expressing concepts about family, honor, and spiritual obligation that white settlers had never needed to develop. Martha caught none of the words, but the tone suggested careful deliberation about what to do with this unexpected discovery. The children argued in whispers, their debate growing more animated as they weighed competing considerations that would have challenged adults twice their age. Hanavi clearly favored leaving the white woman to die. His reasoning was sound according to everything he had been taught about survival and tribal loyalty. His people had suffered greatly at the hands of settlers and soldiers, enduring broken treaties, stolen lands, and the systematic destruction of the buffalo herds that sustained their way of life. Every warrior song spoke of betrayal and broken promises made by those with pale skin. To him, this woman represented everything that threatened his people's existence. Her death would be one small measure of justice in a world that had shown his family little mercy. His arguments carried weight with the others. They had all heard stories of Comanche children stolen by white raiders, of villages burned and families scattered to the 4 winds. The Texas Rangers had put bounties on Comanche scalps, making no distinction between warriors and innocents. Why should they show mercy to one of the people who had declared war on their very existence? The logical choice was to take what supplies. She might have and leave her to the vultures, but Ayanna moved closer to Martha, her healer's instincts overriding tribal prejudices. She had been taught by her grandmother to recognize the signs of heat sickness, and this woman was clearly near death from exposure and dehydration. The girl's small hands hovered over Martha's fevered face, feeling the dangerous heat radiating from her skin like warmth from a cooking fire. She could see the telltale signs of severe dehydration in the sunken eyes and parched skin, conditions that would lead to organ failure and death within hours if left untreated. The young healer turned to the others and spoke urgently, her words punctuated by gestures toward Martha's condition. She had been trained from early childhood to see past surface differences to the universal human need for compassion. Her grandmother had taught her that healing was a sacred duty that transcended tribal boundaries, that the spirits judged healers not by who they helped, but by whether they turned away from suffering when they had the power to ease it. Chaitin, despite his youth, possessed an uncanny ability to read people's hearts that his elders attributed to a special connection with the spirit world. He studied Martha's face with the intensity of a shaman reading omens, taking in details that escaped his older companions. Something in her expression, perhaps the depth of her despair or the way she seemed to have accepted death without anger or hatred, spoke to his young soul. Unlike many white captives he had seen, this woman showed no fear of her Comanche discoverers, only a weary gratitude that transcended racial boundaries. The boy whispered something to Kashina that made her look at Martha with new eyes. His words, translated roughly, suggested that this woman had been cast out by her own people, just as the Comanche had been driven from their ancestral lands. There was a kinship in abandonment, a shared understanding of what it meant to be discarded by those who should have protected and cherished them. The debate continued for several minutes while Martha drifted in and out of consciousness. In her fevered state, she began to hallucinate that the children were angels come to escort her to whatever waited beyond this world of pain and rejection. Their faces seemed to shift and change in the desert heat, sometimes appearing as the babies she had never been able to carry, sometimes as manifestations of some greater spirit that governed this harsh but sacred land. She thought she could hear Jacob's voice among their whispered words, urging her to hold on just a little longer. The spiritual significance of the moment was not lost on the children. They had been taught that nothing happened by chance in the great web of existence that connected all living things. Finding this woman in Scorpion Gulch, a place their people considered both sacred and dangerous, felt like an event heavy with meaning. Perhaps the spirits had guided them here for a purpose that would only become clear with time. Finally, Kashina made the decision that would change all their lives. The weight of leadership, thrust upon her by circumstances and her natural maturity, demanded that she choose between the safety of her people and the demands of basic human compassion. She knelt beside Martha and carefully lifted her head, bringing the water gourd to her cracked lips with the gentle patience of someone who understood that salvation often came in small measures. The liquid was warm and tasted of leather and sage, carrying flavors of a world Martha had never known existed. But to her parched throat and burning tongue, it was more precious than the finest wine from her mother's private stores. She drank greedily until Kashina pulled the gourd away, knowing from her grandmother's teachings that too much water too quickly could be as dangerous as too little. The girl had been taught that healing was as much about restraint as it was about intervention. The water brought enough clarity for Martha to focus on her rescuers' faces properly for the first time. She tried to speak, to thank them for their mercy, but her throat was too damaged to produce more than a hoarse whisper that sounded like wind through dry leaves. Instead, she managed a weak smile that conveyed more gratitude than words ever could. The expression transformed her face, revealing the kind and gentle person hidden beneath the ravages of exposure and despair. The children exchanged glances, recognizing something in that smile that transcended the barriers of language and culture. It was the look of someone who had known love and loss, who understood suffering not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. In that moment, Martha stopped being the white woman and became simply another human being in desperate need of help. What followed was a complex negotiation conducted entirely in gestures and expressions, a form of communication that relied on the universal language of compassion and shared humanity. The children clearly wanted to help, but they also understood the enormous risks involved in saving a white woman's life. If their band's warriors returned to find them harboring an
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
enemy, the consequences could be severe for everyone involved. Children who defied tribal law could be banished or even executed, depending on the circumstances and the mood of the council. Yet something about Martha's helpless condition appealed to their deepest instincts of mercy and protection. These were children who had been raised to value courage and honor above personal safety, who had been taught that true warriors protected the innocent regardless of the personal cost. The question was not whether they should help, but whether they could do so without bringing disaster upon their entire band. 3 days after the Children of the Wind had saved her life, Martha Jane Winchester found herself in a world that defied everything she thought she knew about survival, family, and belonging. The hidden camp where Kashina had brought her lay nestled in a box canyon 20 miles from Scorpion Gulch, invisible from above and accessible only through a narrow passage that could be defended by a single warrior. Ancient cottonwoods provided shade over a spring that bubbled up from deep limestone aquifers, creating an oasis that had sustained Comanche bands for countless generations. Martha's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, though she understood now that it had less to do with divine intervention and more to do with the sophisticated medical knowledge possessed by these so-called savage children. Ayana had proven to be a healer of remarkable skill, using combinations of desert plants that drew toxins from Martha's system, reduced inflammation, and restored her body's natural balance. The girl worked with the confident precision of someone trained by masters, her small hands guided by generations of accumulated wisdom. But healing her body was only the beginning of Martha's transformation. The real challenge lay in navigating the complex social dynamics of a Comanche camp where her presence represented both opportunity and enormous danger. The band's elderly leader, a weathered woman named Nadua, who served as keeper of traditions and arbiter of disputes, had spent 2 days deliberating Martha's fate while the children who saved her waited anxiously for judgment. Nadua herself was a figure of fascinating complexity, a woman whose life story embodied the tragic collision between two incompatible worlds. Born white and captured as a child during a raid 40 years earlier, she had been raised Comanche and had chosen to remain with her adopted people even when offered chances to return to white society. Her dual heritage gave her unique insights into both cultures, but it also made her deeply suspicious of any white person who might threaten the fragile survival of her band. The old woman had questioned Martha extensively through a mixture of broken English, hand signs, and translated conversations with the children. She wanted to know why Martha had been abandoned where her family lived, whether rescue parties might come searching for her. Most importantly, she needed to determine whether this unexpected guest could be trusted with the location of their hidden sanctuary. Martha's answers had been painfully honest. She told Nadua about her barrenness, her mother's cruelty, her abandonment by Samuel Garrett's wagon train. She spoke of having nowhere to go and no one who would miss her, painting a picture of isolation that the old woman recognized all too well. In a world where survival depended on family connections and tribal loyalty, Martha's complete abandonment by her own people marked her as either dangerous or potentially valuable. The turning point came when Nadua asked Martha to demonstrate the skills that had allowed her to survive on a frontier ranch. What followed was a revelation that surprised everyone, including Martha herself. Years of hard work on the Winchester homestead had given her abilities that translated remarkably well to Comanche life. She could start fires with flint and steel faster than most of the children, identify edible plants that her grandmother had taught her to recognize, and treat common ailments with herbal remedies that overlap significantly with traditional Comanche medicine. More importantly, Martha possessed knowledge that could benefit the entire band. She understood the seasonal patterns of white settlement, knew which areas were likely to be patrolled by rangers, and could predict where supply wagons and cattle drives might be vulnerable to raids. Her information about the location of ranches, the schedules of mail deliveries, and the movements of military patrols was invaluable to a people engaged in guerrilla warfare against an expanding empire. But it was Martha's response to the children themselves that ultimately sealed her acceptance into the band. Rather than treating Kashina, Hanavi, Ayana, and Chayton as curiosities or objects of pity, she interacted with them as the capable young people they were. She listened when they spoke, learned from their expertise, and gradually began to see the world through their eyes. The barriers of race and culture started to dissolve under the simple recognition of shared humanity. Kashina became her primary teacher in the subtle art of Comanche survival. The girl showed Martha how to move silently through brush, how to read the signs left by passing animals, how to find water in seemingly barren landscape. More importantly, she taught Martha the complex web of relationships and obligations that held Comanche society together. Every person had a role, every action had consequences, and survival depended on understanding one's place in the larger pattern of tribal life. Hanavi proved to be an expert in the warrior arts that seemed so foreign to Martha's civilized upbringing. He demonstrated how to use terrain for concealment, how to approach enemies without being detected, how to strike swiftly and disappear before retaliation could occur. His training was not mere military technique, but a philosophy of warfare that emphasized intelligence, patience, and the psychological advantage of fighting on familiar ground. Under his tutelage, Martha learned to see the desert not as an empty wasteland, but as a complex tactical environment full of opportunities for those who understood its secrets. Rock formations could provide cover, wind patterns could mask sounds and scents, and the harsh conditions that defeated most enemies could be turned into weapons by those adapted to desert warfare. Ayana continued Martha's education in the healing arts, teaching her to recognize and prepare medicines from plants that grew wild throughout the territory. The girl's knowledge was encyclopedic, covering not just the physical properties of various herbs, but their spiritual significance and proper ceremonial use. Martha learned that healing among the Comanche involved treating the whole person, addressing spiritual imbalances as well as physical symptoms. The young healer also taught Martha about childbirth and infant care, subjects that carried particular poignancy given her own reproductive failures. Ayana's matter-of-fact discussions of pregnancy, delivery, and child-rearing helped Martha understand that her barrenness, while unfortunate, did not make her worthless as a woman. In Comanche society, women who could not bear children often became healers, teachers, or spiritual leaders, finding fulfillment through different forms of nurturing. Chayton, despite his youth, possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations that made him invaluable as both scout and counselor. He taught Martha to observe the subtle signs that revealed a person's true intentions, to notice the small changes in behavior that might indicate danger or opportunity. His lessons went far beyond mere observation to encompass a kind of empathic understanding that bordered on mind reading. Through the boy's patient instruction, Martha learned to sense the emotional currents that flowed through the camp, to understand when tensions were rising or when celebrations were in order. This skill proved invaluable in navigating the complex social dynamics of her new environment, helping her avoid conflicts that could have resulted in her expulsion or worse. As days turned into weeks, Martha found herself settling into rhythms. of life that felt more natural than anything she had experienced in her mother's rigid household. She rose before dawn to help prepare communal meals, spent her mornings learning traditional crafts from the camp's elder women, and devoted her afternoons to practical lessons with the children who had saved her life. Evenings were for storytelling, singing, and the quiet conversations that bound communities together. The work was harder than anything she had known at the Winchester Ranch, but it felt purposeful in a way that her previous life had never achieved. Every task, from gathering firewood to tanning hides, contributed directly to the band's survival. There were no idle ornaments or meaningless social rituals, no energy wasted on activities that served only to display wealth or status. Everything had a function, everything mattered. Martha's integration into the band was not without challenges. Some of the older warriors remained suspicious of her presence, arguing that any white person represented a potential security risk. They pointed out that her knowledge of their location could be devastating if she ever fell into enemy hands, and they questioned whether someone raised in civilized comfort could truly adapt to the harsh realities of nomadic life. These concerns came to a head during a council meeting held 3 weeks after Martha's arrival. The band's war chief, a scarred veteran named Quana, who had lost his wife and children to a cavalry raid, spoke passionately against allowing any white person to remain among them. His arguments were logical and compelling, based on decades of experience with broken treaties and betrayed trusts. But the children who had saved Martha's life spoke just as passionately in her defense. Kashina testified to Martha's rapid mastery of survival skills and her willingness to embrace Comanche ways. Hanavi described how she had helped him track a wounded deer, demonstrating knowledge of animal behavior that rivaled his own. Ayana spoke of Martha's gentle assistance with sick and injured band members, her natural empathy making her an effective healer despite her lack of formal training. Most powerfully, young Chayton stood before the assembled adults and delivered what amounted to a prophecy. In the serious tones of someone far older than his years, he declared that the spirits had guided them to Martha for a purpose that would only become clear with time. He spoke of dreams in which he had seen her teaching Comanche children ways of the white world, preparing them for the battles that lay ahead. The boy's words carried special weight because he had already demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict future events. His warnings had saved the band from cavalry patrols on 2 separate occasions, and his dreams often contained information that proved accurate days or weeks later. When Chayton spoke of spiritual guidance, even the most skeptical warriors listened. Carefully, the debate continued for hours, with various band members offering arguments for and against Martha's permanent acceptance. Some worried about the practical implications of harboring a white woman, while others saw her as a valuable source of intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. The discussion revealed deep divisions within the band about how to respond to the inexorable pressure of white expansion. Finally, Old Nadua rose to speak, her words carrying the authority of someone who had bridged both worlds and survived to tell the tale. She reminded the council that their band's strength had always come from their ability to adapt, to incorporate useful elements from other cultures while maintaining their essential identity. Martha's knowledge and skills could help them survive the changing times, but only if they could trust her completely. The old woman proposed a solution that satisfied both pragmatic and spiritual concerns. Martha would undergo a formal adoption ceremony that would make her a true member of the band, bound by the same obligations and protected by the same rights as any blood relative. The ritual would include tests of courage and loyalty that would prove her commitment to her new people beyond any reasonable doubt. The ceremony itself was scheduled for the next full moon, giving Martha time to prepare both physically and spiritually for the challenges ahead. The children who had saved her life became her guides and instructors, teaching her the proper prayers, the symbolic meanings of various ritual elements, and the serious obligation she would be accepting. Kashina explained that adoption into A Comanche band was not merely a legal formality, but a spiritual transformation that created genuine kinship bonds. Once the ceremony was complete, Martha would be expected to put the welfare of her new family above her own interests, to share in both the dangers and the rewards of nomadic life, and to pass on her adopted culture to future generations. The prospect of belonging somewhere, truly belonging, filled Martha with emotions she had thought lost forever. After years of being told she was worthless because of her inability to bear children, she was being offered a chance to become mother, sister, and daughter to an entire community. The irony was not lost on her that she had found acceptance among people her own culture considered savage. As the night of the ceremony approached, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought her from the civilized brutality of her mother's ranch to this hidden canyon where love was measured not by blood ties but by loyalty and mutual support. She thought of her sister Emma's children, growing up on stolen land with hearts hardened against the people who had lived there first, and she wondered if they would ever know the kind of authentic community she had discovered among their supposed enemies. The transformation was not complete, but already Martha could feel herself becoming someone new. Someone stronger and more complete than the broken woman who had been left to die in Scorpion Gulch. The desert that had nearly claimed her life was revealing itself as the birthplace of her true identity, the crucible where Martha Jane Winchester would die and someone entirely new would be born. The full moon hung like a silver shield above the hidden canyon, as Martha Jane Winchester prepared to shed her old identity forever. 6 weeks had passed since Kashina and her companions had pulled her from the jaws of death in Scorpion Gulch, and tonight the adoption ceremony would either transform her into a true daughter of the Comanche nation or expose her as unworthy of the trust these people had placed in her. Around the sacred fire, painted warriors and decorated women gathered in a circle that had witnessed countless such transformations throughout the generations. The ceremonial preparation had begun. 3 days earlier, with a ritual cleansing that stripped away not just physical impurities, but the spiritual contamination of her previous life. Martha had fasted under Ayana's careful supervision, drinking only sacred teas brewed from plants that grew in secret places, known only to the band's medicine women. The process had left her lightheaded but strangely clear-minded, as if layers of confusion and self-doubt were being burned away by inner fire that had been kindled by weeks of intensive spiritual preparation. During those 3 days of purification, Martha had been required to confront every aspect of her former existence that might interfere with her complete transformation. She spent hours in meditation, guided by Nadua's patient instruction, examining her memories of life at the Winchester Ranch and systematically releasing the emotional attachments that bound her to that world. The process was more painful than any physical ordeal, requiring her to acknowledge the ways her mother's cruelty had shaped her sense of self-worth and poisoned her understanding of family loyalty. The meditation sessions took place in a sacred cave behind the hidden spring, where the walls were covered with pictographs created by countless generations of vision seekers. Ancient hands had painted images of buffalo hunts, warrior exploits, and spiritual encounters that stretched back beyond the reach of living memory. Martha found herself studying these primitive artworks with growing understanding, recognizing that each figure represented not just historical events, but spiritual truths that transcended the boundaries of time and culture. Nadua herself had overseen Martha's spiritual preparation, teaching her the prayers and chants that would guide her through the transformation ahead. The old woman's own journey from white captive to Comanche elder gave her unique authority to judge whether Martha possessed the strength and flexibility necessary to bridge two worlds successfully. Her weathered hands had painted sacred symbols on Martha's face using pigments mixed with ash from ceremonial fires and clay from the sacred spring that bubbled up from the heart of the earth. The geometric patterns were not mere decoration, but spiritual armor, each line and curve carrying meanings that connected the wearer to the vast web of relationships that sustained Comanche cosmology. The red ochre represented the blood of warriors who had died defending their people, mixed with ground minerals that had absorbed the power of sacred places over countless centuries. The yellow symbolized the sun that gave life to all creation, derived from flowers that bloomed only during the most auspicious times of year. The white clay spoke of the purity required to receive visions from the spirit world, gathered from deposits that had been blessed by generations of medicine workers. Each pigment required specific prayers during its application, ancient words that invoked the protection of ancestral spirits and opened pathways for divine communication. Martha struggled with the pronunciation of these sacred syllables, her tongue fighting against linguistic patterns that had been shaped by generations of English speech. But Nadua was patient, correcting her mistakes with gentle persistence, until the prayers flowed smoothly from her lips like water from a mountain spring. But the ceremony demanded more than spiritual preparation. Martha would be required to demonstrate practical skills that proved her ability to contribute meaningfully to the band's survival in an increasingly hostile world. Over the past weeks, she had trained intensively with weapons that felt alien in her hands, but gradually became extensions of her will. The bow that Hanavi had crafted specifically for her was shorter and more recurved than the longbows used by white hunters, designed for mounted warfare and the close-quarters combat that characterized Comanche fighting tactics. The weapon itself was a work of art as much as a tool of war, crafted from seasoned Osage orange wood that had been aged in sacred caves for 7 years before being shaped by hands that understood both the spiritual and mechanical requirements of effective archery. The bowstring was made from sinew taken from buffalo that had been killed during ceremonial hunts, each strand carrying the power and spirit of the great beasts that had sustained the people for countless generations. Hanavi had decorated the grip with intricate carvings that told the story of successful hunts and victorious battles, creating a weapon that was both functional and beautiful. Her first attempts at archery had been embarrassingly clumsy, arrows flying wide of their targets or falling short of distant marks that seemed impossibly small from any practical shooting distance. The bow felt awkward in her hands, its draw weight heavier than anything she had used during her ranch days, its balance point different from the hunting weapons she had occasionally handled. But Hanavi proved to be a patient teacher, breaking down the complex motions into manageable components and gradually building her muscle memory through endless repetition that continued from dawn until dusk. The young warrior's instruction went far beyond mere technique to encompass the philosophical foundations of Comanche warfare. He explained how successful fighting required the integration of physical skill with spiritual power, how warriors prepared for battle through ceremonies that aligned their personal energy with the cosmic forces that governed life and death. Martha learned to see her bow not just as a hunting tool, but as a sacred instrument that connected her to the great circle of predator and prey that sustained all existence. The training regimen was brutal by any standard, requiring Martha to practice her archery while performing increasingly difficult physical tasks. She learned to shoot accurately while running across rough terrain, while hanging upside down from tree branches, while balancing on narrow logs suspended over stream beds. Each exercise was designed to prepare her for the chaotic conditions of actual combat, where perfect form would be impossible and survival would depend on instinctive reactions, honed through countless hours of practice. The breakthrough came during her 4th week of training when Martha successfully brought down a jackrabbit at 50 yards while riding one of the band's war ponies at full gallop. The shot required splitting her attention between controlling an unfamiliar mount and making precise calculations about trajectory and timing, skills that could only be developed through the kind of integrated training that began in early childhood among the Comanche. The clean kill earned her a war cry of approval from Hanavi that echoed across the canyon like thunder. But archery was only one element of the warrior skills Martha needed to master. Kashina had been equally demanding in teaching her the subtle, arts of reconnaissance and infiltration that made Comanche warriors so effective against conventional military forces. The girl showed her how to move through brush without disturbing vegetation, how to use natural camouflage to become invisible in open terrain, how to approach enemy positions without triggering the instinctive awareness that warned experienced soldiers of danger. These lessons took place during increasingly ambitious scouting expeditions that ranged far from the safety of the hidden canyon, ventures that carried real risk of discovery by hostile forces. Martha learned to read the signs left by cavalry patrols, to identify the tracks of different military units, to predict the routes that supply wagons would take between distant forts. Her knowledge of white military organization proved invaluable in interpreting intelligence gathered by Comanche scouts who could observe enemy movements but lacked the cultural context to understand their significance. The scouting expeditions also revealed the devastating impact that white expansion was having on the traditional Comanche way of life. Martha saw springs that had been poisoned by mining operations, grasslands that had been overgrazed by cattle until they could no longer support the buffalo herds that had sustained indigenous communities for thousands of years. She witnessed the systematic destruction of an entire ecosystem that had been carefully managed by native peoples for countless generations through controlled burning, selective hunting, and spiritual practices that maintained the balance between human needs and natural abundance. During one memorable expedition, Martha and Kashina discovered a Texas Ranger camp that had been established uncomfortably close to several traditional Comanche gathering places. The Rangers were clearly planning a sweep through the area, hoping to catch nomadic bands during their seasonal migrations to winter hunting grounds. Their position had been chosen with military precision, blocking access to water sources and forcing any traveling bands to expose themselves while crossing open terrain. The mission required Martha to infiltrate the Ranger camp disguised as a lost traveler seeking directions to the nearest settlement. Her performance had to be convincing enough to avoid suspicion while gathering information about patrol schedules, planned routes, and the location of other military units operating in the region. The deception was made more challenging by her growing psychological distance from white culture, which made it difficult to project the attitudes and mannerisms that would be expected from a genuine settler. Martha's ability to eavesdrop on their conversations without arousing suspicion provided crucial intelligence that allowed friendly bands to avoid the trap entirely. She learned that the Rangers were part of a coordinated campaign designed to drive all native peoples from a vast area that had been designated for white settlement. The military was preparing to establish a series of forts that would control every water source and travel route, making traditional nomadic life impossible. The success of that mission earned Martha grudging respect from some of the bands, most skeptical warriors, but it also demonstrated the dangerous double-edged nature of her position. Her white appearance made her an invaluable intelligence asset, but it also meant that discovery by enemy forces would result in interrogation. That could expose the location of every Comanche stronghold she had visited. The knowledge she carried in her head could destroy dozens of bands if it fell into the wrong hands. As the night of the adoption ceremony arrived, Martha faced a series of tests designed to probe not just her physical capabilities, but her psychological readiness to embrace a radically different way of life. The first challenge involved demonstrating her mastery of essential survival skills under the pressure of time constraints and public scrutiny. She would have to start a fire using only flint and steel in high wind, locate and prepare medicinal plants in complete darkness, and track a specific animal through terrain deliberately chosen to confuse and mislead. The fire test nearly ended in disaster when gusting wind repeatedly extinguished her carefully nurtured sparks. Martha's hands shook with nervousness as she worked, aware that dozens of experienced warriors were evaluating her every movement with the critical attention of people whose lives depended on accurate assessment of individual capabilities. The wind seemed to sense her desperation, growing stronger with each attempt and threatening to scatter her tinder before she could coax flame from the precious sparks. The technique required patience and persistence that had been foreign to Martha's previous experience with the immediate gratification of civilized life. She had to resist the impulse to rush, instead building her fire with the methodical care of someone who understood that premature haste could result in complete failure. Each spark had to be nurtured like a newborn child, protected from wind and fed with precisely the right amount of fuel at exactly the right moment. When fire finally caught and blazed up into the night, illuminating the circle of painted faces. With dancing orange light, the assembled Comanche erupted in approving war cries that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The sound filled Martha with a surge of pride and belonging that threatened to overwhelm her composure. These people, who owed her nothing and had every reason to distrust her, were celebrating her small victory as if it were a triumph for their entire community. The plant identification test revealed just how much Martha had absorbed during her weeks of intensive training with the band's healers and medicine workers. Working by moonlight and the glow of the ceremonial fire, she successfully located and prepared 7 different medicinal herbs, explaining their properties and proper dosages in the broken mixture of English and Comanche that had become her primary means of communication. Each plant required different preparation methods, some needing to be ground into powder while others had to be steeped in hot water or chewed fresh. The tracking challenge proved to be the most demanding test of all, requiring Martha to demonstrate not just technical knowledge, but the kind of intuitive understanding that came from truly immersing oneself in the natural world. Given only a brief description of the animal she was supposed to follow, she had to locate its trail in terrain that had been deliberately disturbed by other band members to create false signs and confusing patterns of movement. The trail led through rocky areas where footprints were nearly invisible to untrained eyes, across streams where scent markers had been washed away by running water, and through thick brush that obscured visual clues while snagging clothing and hair. Martha found herself relying on skills she hadn't even known she possessed, reading the subtle signs that indicated an animal's passage through seemingly undisturbed landscape. When she finally cornered her quarry, a young bighorn sheep that had been deliberately driven into the canyon system for the ceremony, Martha faced a moment of profound personal reckoning. The test required her to demonstrate her ability to take life when necessary for the band's survival, but it also forced her to confront the psychological barriers that separated her civilized upbringing from the harsh pragmatism of nomadic existence. The Faye. Successful completion of the practical tests earned Martha the right to proceed to the ceremony's spiritual climax, but the most challenging ordeal still lay ahead. She would be required to undergo a vision quest that would either confirm her spiritual readiness for adoption or reveal her unworthiness in ways that could not be ignored or rationalized away by sympathetic observers. The vision quest began with the consumption of sacred plants that had been gathered from secret locations and prepared according to ancient formulas known only to the band's most experienced shamans. The bitter brew burned her throat and stomach, filling her system with alkaloids that would either open doorways to spiritual insight or drive her into madness depending on her fundamental character and spiritual preparation. As the psychoactive compounds took effect, Martha found herself transported to a realm where the normal boundaries between self and world dissolved into flowing patterns of light and meaning. She experienced visions that seemed more real than ordinary consciousness, encounters with spiritual entities that communicated through direct transfer of knowledge rather than words or images. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and transcendent, challenging every assumption she had ever held about the nature of reality. Her Comanche name, chosen during the vision quest and confirmed by the band's spiritual leaders, was Paheoko, meaning water that brings life to the desert. The name captured both her miraculous survival in the wasteland and her potential to serve as a bridge between two worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict. 3 months after her rebirth as Paheoko, Martha found herself leading a war party against the very people who had raised her, her painted face a mask of fury as she rode beside Hanavi toward a settler wagon train that carried cargo more precious than gold. The irony was not lost on her that she was about to rescue Comanche children who had been stolen from their families and sold into slavery, using tactics that would have horrified the civilized woman she had once been. But Paheoko was no longer bound by the moral constraints of white society, and the intelligence she had gathered during her infiltration missions had revealed horrors that demanded immediate action. The transformation from ceremonial adoption to active warrior had not happened overnight. In the weeks following her vision quest, Martha had been required to prove her loyalty through increasingly dangerous missions that tested both her commitment to her new people and her ability to compartmentalize the emotional conflicts that arose from fighting her former race. The first test had come when Texas Rangers captured 2 young Comanche hunters near a trading post, torturing them for information about hidden camps before executing them in broad daylight as examples to other tribes. Paheoko had witnessed the executions from concealment, her white appearance allowing her to move through the settlement without arousing suspicion, while Comanche scouts would have been shot on sight. The casual brutality of the killings, carried out in front of cheering crowds that included women and children, had completed her psychological transformation in ways that no ceremony could have achieved. She understood now that the conflict between her peoples was not a misunderstanding that could be resolved through negotiation, but a war of extermination that would end only when one side completely destroyed the other. The wagon train she now stalked represented everything evil about white expansion into Comanche territory. Led by a man named Colonel Marcus Whitfield, a former military officer turned slave trader, the convoy carried human cargo that had been purchased from corrupt officials at reservation agencies. Comanche children as young as 5 had been separated from their families under the pretense of providing them with Christian education, then sold to wealthy ranchers who used them as unpaid laborers in conditions that often proved fatal. Whitfield's operation was protected by a squad of hired gunmen who had been recruited from the worst elements of frontier society. These were men who had been cashiered from the army for excessive brutality, bounty hunters who collected scalps without regard for age or gender, and sadistic predators who viewed native peoples as subhuman obstacles to be eliminated through any means necessary. They were well-armed, well-mounted, and experienced in the kind of running warfare that had made conventional military units ineffective against Comanche raiders. But Paheoko possessed advantages that her enemies could not have anticipated. Her intimate knowledge of white military tactics, combined with her growing mastery of Comanche fighting techniques, made her uniquely qualified to plan attacks that exploited the weaknesses of both cultures. She understood how white soldiers thought, what formations they would adopt under pressure, where their blind spots lay during different types of engagements. At the same time, she had absorbed Comanche lessons about mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare that could transform even inferior numbers into decisive advantages. The war party she rode with consisted of 15 carefully chosen warriors, each selected for specific skills that would be essential to the mission's success. Hanavi led the group, his reputation as a tactician earning him command despite his youth, while Kashina and Ayana provided intelligence and medical support from concealed positions that allowed them to observe the enemy without exposing themselves to counterattack. The remaining warriors were veterans of dozens of raids, men whose intimate knowledge of the terrain made them nearly invisible to pursuing forces. The plan Paheoko had developed called for a coordinated assault that would separate the guards from their human cargo while minimizing casualties among the children they were trying to rescue. The wagon train's route followed a predictable path through canyon country that offered numerous opportunities for ambush, but Whitfield's men were too experienced to be caught completely off guard. The attack would have to be swift, decisive, and executed with perfect timing to avoid becoming trapped in a prolonged firefight that would favor the better-armed whites. As the war party approached the designated ambush site, Pahayoko felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread. That preceded violent action. The civilized part of her mind recoiled from what she was about to do, recognizing that crossing this line would make her a criminal in the eyes of every white settlement from Texas to California. But the Comanche warrior she had become understood that mercy was a luxury she could no longer afford when children's lives hung in the balance. The attack began at dawn as the wagon train wound its way through a narrow defile that limited their ability to maneuver or retreat. Pahayoko struck first, her arrow taking down the lead scout before he could cry out a warning, while Hanavi led a mounted charge against the main body of guards. The initial assault was devastating, catching Whitfield's men unprepared for the speed and coordination of the Comanche assault. 3 guards died in the first minute of fighting, their bodies bristling with arrows before they could draw their weapons. But Colonel Whitfield proved to be a more formidable opponent than his reputation had suggested. The former military officer rallied his surviving men with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to command under fire, organizing a defensive perimeter around the wagon train that turned the rescue attempt into a brutal siege. His gunmen were veterans of Indian fighting who knew how to use their superior firepower to offset Comanche mobility advantages. The battle raged for hours under the merciless desert sun, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Whitfield's men were outnumbered but better armed, their repeating rifles and abundant ammunition allowing them to maintain a devastating rate of fire that kept the Comanche warriors at bay. But the attackers possessed superior knowledge of the terrain, using rock formations and natural cover to stage hit-and-run attacks that gradually wore down the defenders' strength and morale. Pahayoko found herself in the position of battlefield commander when Hanavi was wounded by a lucky shot that shattered his left shoulder. The young warrior remained conscious but could no longer effectively lead the assault, leaving tactical decisions to the white woman who had been a Comanche for less than a year. The responsibility was overwhelming, but she had been trained for exactly this situation during the intensive combat instruction that followed her adoption ceremony. Her first decision was to shift tactics from direct assault to psychological warfare, using techniques that exploited the specific fears and prejudices of white fighting men. She directed her warriors to begin a series of blood-curdling war cries that echoed off the canyon walls with supernatural resonance, while simultaneously launching flights of arrows that seemed to come from impossible angles. The goal was to convince Whitfield's men that they were facing a much larger force than actually surrounded them. The strategy proved effective beyond her expectations. Several of the hired gunmen broke under the psychological pressure, abandoning their positions to flee toward imagined safety that did not exist in the maze of canyons surrounding the battlefield. Their panic spread to the remaining defenders, who began firing wildly at shadows and phantom movements that existed only in their fear-addled minds. The disciplined defensive perimeter that Whitfield had established began to crumble under the weight of collective terror, but the colonel himself remained steady under pressure, recognizing the psychological nature of the assault and working to restore order among his panicked men. He began organizing a fighting withdrawal toward more defensible terrain, using the wagons as mobile fortifications while maintaining enough firepower to discourage close pursuit. His military training was evident in every decision, from the selection of covered positions to the coordination of suppressing fire that kept the Comanche warriors from closing to effective range. The turning point came when Pahayoko realized that conventional tactics would not be sufficient to overcome Whitfield's defensive advantages. She needed to do something unexpected, something that would shock the enemy into making fatal mistakes. Drawing on her knowledge of white psychology and her growing understanding of Comanche spiritual warfare, she devised a plan that was both brilliantly effective and completely terrifying to its intended targets. Stripping to the waist and covering her body with war paint in patterns that transformed her white skin into something alien and supernatural, Paheoko mounted her war pony and rode directly toward the enemy position. But instead of attacking with conventional weapons, she began chanting in the ancient Comanche tongue while firing arrows with mechanical precision that seemed to defy human limitations. To the terrified guards, she appeared to be some kind of avenging spirit that had risen from the desert to punish their crimes. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who had fought Indians for years had never encountered anything like this pale-skinned apparition that combined the worst fears of both cultures into a single terrifying figure. Some of Whitfield's men simply threw down their weapons and fled, while others froze in place as if paralyzed by supernatural dread. The carefully maintained defensive formation collapsed entirely as individual survival instincts overcame military discipline. Colonel Whitfield himself was shaken by the sight of this ghostly warrior, who seemed to embody everything evil that frontier mythology associated with Indian warfare. But his military training held firm, and he organized one final desperate gambit designed to break the Comanche assault through sheer firepower. Concentrating his remaining men around a single wagon that contained the most valuable captives, he prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender his human cargo. The final phase of the battle was the most brutal, as Paheoko led her warriors in a series of charges that brought them within arm's reach of the defenders' rifles. Combat became hand-to-hand, with knives and tomahawks replacing arrows and bullets as the primary weapons. The confined space around the wagons turned the fighting into a bloody melee, where individual skill and desperation counted more than tactical superiority or technological advantages. Paheoko found herself face-to-face with Colonel Whitfield. In the climactic moments of the assault, the two leaders locked in personal combat that would determine the fate of the captive children. The colonel was a skilled fighter whose military training had prepared him for exactly this kind of close-quarters battle, but he had never faced an opponent who combined white intelligence with Comanche ferocity in such a lethal combination. The fight was brief but vicious, ending when Paheoko's tomahawk found its mark in Whitfield's chest. The colonel's death broke the last resistance of his men, who surrendered or fled rather than continue fighting without leadership. The wagon train was captured intact, along with 37 Comanche children who had been stolen from their families and destined for lives of slavery and degradation. But victory came at a terrible cost that went far beyond the physical wounds suffered by the war party. Paheoko had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, transforming herself from a woman seeking belonging into a warrior whose very existence represented an existential threat to white civilization. She had become something that neither culture could fully understand or accept, a living symbol of the irreconcilable differences that made peaceful coexistence impossible. The rescue of the children created a new set of challenges that tested Paheoko's leadership abilities in ways that combat never could. Many of the captives had been separated from their families for months or even years, subjected to systematic abuse designed to break their cultural identity and replace it with subservience to white authority. They were traumatized, suspicious of rescue attempts, and in some cases completely unable to remember their original names or tribal affiliations. Ayana took charge of the medical care needed to restore the children's physical health, but the psychological healing would require much more time and patience. Some of the older captives had been so thoroughly broken by their experiences that they initially refused to leave with their rescuers, convinced that any change in their circumstances would only lead to worse abuse. Others had developed a survival strategy based on complete compliance with white expectations, making them reluctant to embrace their original cultural identity. The youngest children were perhaps the most heartbreaking cases, having been captured at ages where their original memories were already fading. They spoke only English, flinched at the sound of Comanche voices, and showed clear signs of the systematic indoctrination designed to transform them into compliant servants. Their rescue was only the beginning of a long process of cultural rehabilitation that would require the patience and wisdom of the entire band. As the war party began the dangerous journey back to their hidden canyon stronghold, Pahayoko found herself grappling with the implications of her actions. The attack on Whitfield's wagon train would bring massive retaliation from military forces that had previously been content to conduct routine patrols through Comanche territory. Her very existence as a white woman fighting alongside native warriors would be seen as an ultimate betrayal that demanded the harshest possible response. The children she had rescued were evidence of crimes that white authorities could not acknowledge, without admitting their complicity in systematic genocide. Rather than investigating the slave trade that had torn these families apart, military commanders would be under pressure to eliminate all witnesses to activities that violated both federal law and basic human decency. The war party had saved 37 lives, but they had also signed death warrants for every Comanche band operating in the region. More personally troubling was Pahayoko's growing realization that she was becoming something that neither of her cultures could fully accept. To her adopted Comanche family, she would always be the white woman who had chosen to fight beside them, valued for her unique abilities, but never quite trusted as a true member of the tribe. To white society, she had become a renegade whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about racial loyalty and civilized behavior. The psychological isolation was almost unbearable, made worse by the knowledge that her actions were creating ripple effects that would impact innocent people on both sides of the conflict. Every successful raid she planned would bring military reprisals against Comanche bands that had played no role in her war against the slave traders. Every white settlement that fell victim to her intelligence gathering would respond with increased hatred toward all native peoples. But as she looked back at the rescued children riding behind her, some already beginning to remember fragments of their original languages and cultural practices, Pahayoko knew that she had made the only choice her conscience would allow. These were not abstract principles or political considerations, but real human beings whose lives had been saved through actions that civilized society would condemn as barbaric terrorism. The hidden canyon came into view as the sun reached its zenith, its familiar cliffs and cottonwood trees offering sanctuary from a world that had become increasingly hostile to anyone who refused to accept the inevitability of cultural genocide. But Pahayoko understood that this refuge was temporary at best, that the war she had joined would ultimately consume everything she had come to love about her new life. As the war party rode through the narrow entrance to their stronghold, children and elders emerged from their shelters to welcome the returning warriors and the precious cargo they had rescued. The celebration that followed was muted by the knowledge that their victory had probably doomed them all, that the sanctuary they had built in this remote canyon would soon be discovered and destroyed by forces seeking revenge for Pahayoko's crimes against white civilization. But for now, in this moment of triumph and homecoming, the rescued children were reunited with families who had given them up for dead. Tears of joy mixed with war paint as mothers embraced sons they had never expected to see again, while fathers who had spent months planning hopeless rescue attempts found their prayers answered by warriors who had succeeded against impossible. ODD's Pahayoko watched these reunions with emotions too complex for any single culture to understand, knowing that she had found her true purpose in a world that would never forgive her for choosing love over loyalty to the race that had birthed her. The thunder of cavalry hooves echoed through the hidden canyon like the drumbeat of approaching doom, shattering the peaceful morning as 200 soldiers in blue uniforms poured through passages that no white man was supposed to know existed. General William Sherman himself led the assault, his scarred face twisted with fury as he sought vengeance against the white woman who had dared to make war on her own race. Pahayoko stood at the canyon's heart, watching her adopted world burn around her while the children she had saved from slavery cowered behind rocks that offered no protection from the systematic destruction of everything she had learned to love. The discovery of their sanctuary had been inevitable from the moment Pahayoko chose to rescue those captive children 3 months earlier. Colonel Whitfield's death had triggered a massive military response that brought together resources from across the frontier, uniting normally competing commands in a shared determination to hunt down the mysterious white woman who had become a symbol of everything they feared about the ongoing Indian Wars. Bounty hunters, Army scouts, and Texas Rangers had combed the desert for weeks, following cold trails and interrogating captured warriors, until someone finally broke under torture and revealed the location of the hidden stronghold. The assault had begun before dawn, with coordinated attacks through multiple canyon entrances that demonstrated sophisticated planning and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Someone had provided the military with detailed maps of passages that the Comanche had considered secret for generations, indicating that the betrayal came from within their own ranks. The surprise was complete, catching the band's warriors scattered across the canyon floor with no time to organize an effective defense. Pahayoko had awakened to the sound of gunfire and war cries, but these were not the triumphant shouts of Comanche raiders returning from successful missions. These were the desperate screams of people fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, the death songs of warriors who knew they would not see another sunrise. She emerged from her shelter to find chaos everywhere, with blue-coated soldiers advancing through the cottonwood groves while Comanche families fled toward defensive positions that existed only in their increasingly desperate imaginations. The military had learned from previous defeats at the hands of mobile Comanche war parties, adapting their tactics to exploit the unique vulnerabilities created when native peoples were forced to defend fixed positions. Instead of the rigid formations that had proven ineffective in open country, Sherman's troops advanced in loose skirmish lines that could respond quickly to changing conditions while maintaining devastating firepower. They had also brought artillery, pieces that could destroy defensive positions from ranges where Comanche arrows were useless. Kashina appeared at Pahayoko's side, her young face streaked with tears and war paint as she reported the catastrophic situation developing throughout the canyon. The main warrior force had been caught in the open while returning from a hunting expedition, cut down by rifle fire before they could reach cover. The elderly and infirm were trapped in the sacred cave system, but soldiers with torches were already moving to smoke them out like vermin. Worst of all, the children they had rescued from Whitfield's slave train were scattered across the battlefield, too terrified to move and too young to understand the tactical situation that was unfolding around them. The girl's report confirmed Pahayoko's worst fears about the consequences of her decision to make war on white civilization. Her actions had brought destruction not just to her adopted family, but to innocent children who had already suffered more trauma than any human beings should be forced to endure. The irony was overwhelming. In trying to save them from slavery, she had delivered them into the hands of soldiers who would show even less mercy than the traitors who had originally captured them. But there was no time for self-recrimination or philosophical reflection about the unintended consequences of righteous action. The immediate challenge was survival, and that would require every skill that Pahayoko had learned during her transformation from abandoned white woman to Comanche war leader. She quickly assessed the tactical situation, identifying escape routes that might still be viable in defensive positions that could buy time for the most vulnerable members of the band. The canyon's geography offered both advantages and disadvantages for the defenders. The narrow passages that had made their stronghold difficult to discover also limited options for retreat, while the high walls that provided concealment from aerial observation could become death traps if the soldiers gained control of the rim positions. But Pahayoko's unique background gave her insights into white military thinking that purely Comanche leaders would have lacked. She understood that Sherman's primary objective was not the complete annihilation of the band, but the capture of specific individuals who could be used for propaganda purposes. The general needed living proof that his campaign against renegade elements was succeeding, and nothing would serve that purpose better than parading the infamous white woman warrior before newspaper reporters and government officials. This knowledge suggested tactical opportunities that might not be obvious to someone thinking purely in terms of conventional warfare. Working with desperate efficiency, Pahayoko organized the surviving warriors into small groups that could harass the advancing soldiers while the non-combatants attempted to reach escape routes that led deeper into the canyon system. The strategy required sacrificing defensive positions that had been prepared over months, but it offered the only realistic hope of preventing complete disaster. Each group was assigned specific objectives and rally points, with fallback positions identified in case the primary plan failed. Hanavi, still recovering from the shoulder wound he had received during the rescue mission, took command of one group tasked with protecting the children who had been scattered during the initial assault. His injuries limited his physical capabilities, but his tactical knowledge remained intact, and he understood better than anyone the importance of keeping those rescued captives alive. Their deaths would render meaningless all the sacrifices that had been made to free them from bondage. Ayana led another group focused on evacuating the wounded and elderly, who could not move quickly enough to keep pace with a fighting retreat. Her medical knowledge made her invaluable for treating injuries sustained during the ongoing battle. But more importantly, her gentle nature provided emotional support for traumatized civilians who were witnessing the destruction of their entire world. The young healer had matured rapidly during the months since Pahayoko's adoption, developing leadership qualities that complemented her medical skills. The battle that followed was unlike anything in Pahayoko's experience, combining the technological advantages of white military organization with the intimate terrain knowledge that had made Comanche warriors so effective in previous conflicts. But this time the advantages were reversed, with the defenders forced to fight on ground chosen by their enemies, while lacking the mobility that had traditionally offset their numerical inferiority. Sherman's troops advanced with methodical precision, using their superior firepower to suppress any organized resistance, while gradually constricting the area available to the defenders. The general himself directed the assault from a command position that allowed him to coordinate the movements of multiple units while remaining safely out of range of Comanche weapons. His reputation as one of the Union Army's most effective commanders was clearly evident in the sophisticated tactical plan that was unfolding. But Pahayoko possessed one advantage that Sherman could not have anticipated: her intimate knowledge of the canyon's hidden features that even longtime Comanche residents had never discovered. During her months of exploration with the children who had saved her life, she had found passages and chambers that seemed to exist outside the normal geography of the area. Some of these spaces showed evidence of ancient occupation, suggesting that previous cultures had used this region as a refuge during their own times of crisis. Leading a small group of warriors through one of these forgotten passages, Pahayoko emerged behind the main line of advancing soldiers and launched a surprise attack that disrupted their careful coordination. The assault was brief but devastating, eliminating key officers and creating confusion that allowed other defender groups to break free from positions where they had been trapped. But the success was temporary, as Sherman quickly adapted to the changed tactical situation. The general's response demonstrated why he had been chosen to lead this campaign against one of the frontier's most elusive enemies. Instead of allowing the surprise attack to panic his troops into hasty decisions, he consolidated his forces around defensive positions, while sending out patrols to locate and seal the hidden passages that had allowed the defenders to strike at his flanks. His military experience had taught him that patience was often more valuable than aggressive action when dealing with unconventional opponents. As the battle entered its third hour, Pakayoko realized that conventional resistance was no longer viable. Too many warriors had been killed or wounded, ammunition was running low, and the remaining civilians were trapped in positions that would become untenable once the soldiers brought up their artillery pieces. The time had come for the kind of desperate gambit that might save a few lives at the cost of accepting overall defeat. The plan she conceived was both brilliant and heartbreaking, requiring her to use her unique status as a white woman fighting with the Comanche to create opportunities for others to escape while accepting she herself would almost certainly be captured or killed. She would present herself as a target too valuable for Sherman to ignore, drawing the main force away from escape routes while her adopted family attempted to reach safety in the deeper canyon system. But before implementing this final strategy, Pakayoko needed to ensure that the most important mission objective was accomplished regardless of what happened to her. The rescued children had to survive, not just because their lives had intrinsic value, but because they represented hope for cultural continuity in the face of systematic genocide. Their survival would prove that the sacrifices made to save them had not been meaningless. Working with Kushina and the other young people who had become her closest allies, Pakayoko organized a final evacuation attempt that would move the rescued children through passages so narrow and dangerous that pursuing soldiers would be unable to follow effectively. The route led through underground chambers filled with poisonous gases and treacherous rock formations that had claimed lives, even among experienced Comanche explorers. The farewell scene that followed was devastating in its emotional intensity. As Pakayoko said goodbye to the children who had saved her life in Scorpion, Gulch shaped her transformation into someone she had never imagined becoming. Kushina, now 15 and bearing responsibilities that should have belonged to adults, wept openly as she embraced the white woman who had become her sister in all but blood. The girl understood that this separation was likely permanent, that the war they were fighting would allow no room for reunion or reconciliation. Hanavi, despite his wounded shoulder, insisted on remaining with Pakayoko for the final phase of the battle. His warrior's code would not permit him to abandon someone who had fought beside him, regardless of the hopelessness of their situation. Together, they would make the kind of last stand that would become legend among their people, demonstrating that courage could survive even the complete destruction of everything worth defending. As the evacuation began, Pakayoko positioned herself in the canyon's most visible location and began the war chant that would announce her presence to the advancing soldiers. Her voice carried across the battlefield with supernatural clarity, speaking words in the ancient Comanche tongue that invoked the protection of ancestral spirits, while challenging her enemies to face her in personal combat. The psychological effect was immediate and profound, as Sherman's troops recognized that they were confronting the mysterious white warrior whose exploits had become frontier legend. General Sherman himself responded to the challenge, emerging from his command position to face the woman whose actions had required him to divert resources from more conventional military objectives. The confrontation between them was both personal and symbolic, representing the irreconcilable differences between two worldviews that could never coexist peacefully. Sherman saw Pakayoko as a traitor who had betrayed her racial obligations, while she viewed him as the embodiment of a civilization that could only sustain itself through the systematic destruction of alternative ways of life. The dialogue that followed was conducted in English, allowing Sherman's troops to understand the ideological foundations of the conflict they were fighting. Pakayoko spoke eloquently about the moral bankruptcy of a society that justified child slavery while claiming to represent Christian civilization, while Sherman defended the necessity of harsh measures to secure peace and prosperity for law-abiding citizens. Neither participant expected to change the other's mind, but both understood the importance of articulating their positions for history's judgment. The general offered Paheoko terms of surrender that would spare her life in exchange for information about other Comanche strongholds and the names of white sympathizers who had provided assistance to native resistance movements. The proposal was generous by military standards, but it required her to betray people who had shown her more loyalty and affection than her birth family had ever provided. Her refusal was immediate and absolute, spoken with the quiet dignity of someone who had found peace with the consequences of her choices. Sherman's response revealed both respect for his opponent's courage and frustration with her intransigence. He had hoped to end the confrontation without further bloodshed, recognizing that Paheoko's death would transform her into a martyr whose example might inspire other acts of racial betrayal. But her refusal to cooperate left him no choice except to order the final assault that would eliminate the threat she represented while demonstrating the futility of resistance to federal authority. The last battle was brief but intense, as Paheoko and Hanavi made their stand against overwhelming odds while the rescued children disappeared into passages that would carry them toward uncertain freedom. Their weapons were primitive compared to military rifles, but their fighting spirit was unbreakable, sustained by the knowledge that every moment they survived increased the chances for others to escape. They fought with the desperate courage of people who had nothing left to lose except their honor. When the ammunition was exhausted and their weapons broken, Paheoko and Hanavi continued fighting with knives and bare hands until wounds and exhaustion finally brought them down. But their sacrifice had achieved its purpose, buying precious time for the evacuation, while demonstrating that the Comanche spirit could not be broken by military force alone. Their deaths marked the end of organized resistance in the canyon, but they also ensured that the story of their struggle would survive to inspire future generations. As smoke from burning shelters rose toward the desert sky and the sound of gunfire faded into silence, General Sherman surveyed the battlefield that would secure his reputation as an effective Indian fighter. The campaign had achieved its immediate objectives, eliminating a significant threat to frontier security, while demonstrating federal commitment to protecting white settlements. But the general was experienced enough to recognize that military victories did not necessarily translate into lasting peace. The rescued children who had escaped through the hidden passages would grow up carrying memories of this day, understanding that their freedom had been purchased with the blood of heroes who chose to die rather than submit to injustice. Some would become warriors themselves, continuing the cycle of violence that seemed to define relations between their peoples. Others would become healers and teachers, working to preserve cultural traditions that might otherwise be lost to systematic oppression. In the years that followed, stories about the white woman warrior would spread throughout both native and white communities, growing in scope and significance with each retelling. To the Comanche, Paheoko became a symbol of the possibility for genuine adoption across racial lines, proof that kinship could be based on shared values rather than blood relationships. To white society, she represented the ultimate betrayal, a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing sentiment to override racial loyalty. But perhaps the most important legacy of her brief life was the demonstration that individuals could choose their own identities regardless of the circumstances of their birth. In a world increasingly dominated by rigid categories and tribal hatreds, Paheoko had proven that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that societies created to justify their worst impulses. She had been abandoned in Scorpion Gulch as a barren failure, but she died as a mother to children who would carry her memory forward into an uncertain future. The hidden canyon would remain empty for decades, slowly reclaimed by desert vegetation that erased most traces of the community that had briefly flourished there. But in the sacred cave where ancient pictographs recorded the stories of previous cultures, new images appeared that depicted a pale-skinned woman riding alongside Comanche warriors. These mysterious paintings would puzzle archaeologists for generations, their existence unexplained by conventional historical records. She could not bear children, so her family left her to die in the desert wasteland. But the children who found her taught her that family is not about blood, but about the courage to choose love over loyalty to a world that has already chosen hatred. 5 years had passed since the massacre at the Hidden Canyon and the desert. Wind still carried echoes of the battle that had claimed so many lives. In a cave system 50 miles south of the destroyed stronghold, a small group of Comanche survivors had built a new sanctuary among rocks that glowed red in the setting sun. Here, hidden from the patrols that still scoured the territory for remaining hostiles, the children who had escaped through Pahayoko's sacrifice were growing into young adults who carried her memory like a sacred flame. Kashina, now 20 years old and bearing the responsibilities of leadership that war had thrust upon her, stood before a circle of rescued children as she prepared to tell the story that defined their community. Her face bore scars from the final battle, but her eyes still held the intelligence and compassion that had made her Pahayoko's closest ally. Around her sat 15 young people whose lives had been saved by the white woman warrior's decision to die rather than surrender. Tonight we speak of Pahayoko, Kashina began, using the formal cadence that marked important tribal narratives. The water that brought life to the desert, the pale mother who chose us over her own blood, the warrior who proved that family is not about the color of skin, but about the courage to stand beside those who need protection. The children leaned forward, though they had heard this story countless times before. Each telling revealed new details, new lessons about sacrifice and belonging that shaped their understanding of who they were meant to become. The youngest listener was a girl of perhaps 10, one of the children rescued from Colonel Whitfield's slave train who had been too traumatized to speak for months after the canyon battle. She had slowly recovered her voice under the patient care of Ayana, who had survived the massacre by leading a group of wounded through passages so narrow that pursuing soldiers could not follow. Now the girl spoke fluent Comanche again, but she also retained enough English to serve as a translator when the band encountered white travelers willing to trade rather than fight. Tell us about the time she rode against the blue soldiers, requested a boy whose Comanche name meant Morning Star, though his birth certificate from the government school had listed him as Thomas. He had been 8 years old when Pahayoko led the rescue mission that freed him from bondage, and his memories of that day had become the foundation of his identity. Every night he practiced with the bow and arrows that Hanavi had taught him to craft, preparing for the war he believed would eventually come. Kashina smiled at the familiar request, understanding that these children needed to hear about moments of triumph as much as tales of sacrifice. She painted herself for war like a spirit of vengeance, the young leader continued, her white skin transformed by sacred ochre until she became something that neither world could claim or control. The soldiers had never seen anything like her, this ghost rider who fought with Comanche courage but understood white tactics better than their own officers. But the greatest victory was not won with weapons, Kashina continued, her voice growing soft as she reached the heart of the story. The greatest victory was teaching us that love creates stronger bonds than blood, that a family chosen freely is more powerful than one assigned by birth. Pahayoko could have fled to safety in the white settlements, could have reclaimed her old life and forgotten about us entirely. Instead, she chose to die with honor among people who valued her heart more than her heritage. The circle fell silent as the implications of that choice settled over them like evening shadows. These children understood better than most that identity was not fixed at birth, but could be transformed through courage, loyalty, and the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for a greater cause. Pahayoko's example had taught them that belonging was something earned through action rather than inherited through genetics. Ayana, now 18 and serving as the band's primary healer, added her own memories to the narrative. She taught me that medicine is not just about treating wounds, but about healing the spirit that gives life meaning. The young woman said, her hands busy with the preparation of herbal remedies that combine traditional Comanche knowledge with techniques learned from observing white medical practices. Every person we save, every life we preserve, honors her memory and continues the work she began. As the storytelling session concluded and the children dispersed to their evening duties, Kashina walked to the cave entrance where ancient pictographs recorded the stories of previous cultures who had sought refuge in these same chambers. But among the traditional images of buffalo hunts and warrior exploits, new paintings had appeared that depicted a pale-skinned woman riding alongside Comanche warriors. These mysterious figures seemed to glow in the firelight, their existence a testament to the power of stories that transcended the boundaries between history and legend. The wind outside carried sounds from the changing world beyond their hidden sanctuary. The whistle of trains carrying settlers to new territories, the lowing of cattle being driven to distant markets, the occasional crack of rifles as remaining native resistance was systematically eliminated. But it also carried older sounds that spoke of continuity and survival. The cry of hawks riding thermal currents, the rustle of grass that had witnessed countless generations of human struggle, the eternal conversation between earth and sky that would continue long after all the current conflicts were forgotten. In the morning, some of these children would venture into that changing world, carrying with them the lessons that Paheoko had died to preserve. They would become teachers and healers, warriors and peacemakers, bridges between cultures that seemed destined for eternal conflict. But they would never forget the white woman who had shown them that identity was a choice rather than a destiny, that love could transcend every boundary that hatred tried to create. She had been abandoned in Scorpion Gulch for being barren, left to die by people who measured worth through biological function rather than spiritual capacity. But the children who found her had given her something more precious than her own offspring. They had given her a purpose that would echo through generations, a legacy written not in blood, but in the courage to choose family over race, justice over comfort, and love over the fear that divides one human heart from another. The legend of Paheoko would survive as long as people remembered that belonging is earned through loyalty, that families are created through choice, and that sometimes the greatest act of motherhood is dying so that other people's children might live free.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.